Well, I hope you've been having a good conference so far. And when I was asked to speak here, and I was going to speak to the kind of main room, and there's a lot of you, and I guess you all work in different parts of the stack. And I thought what I would talk about is really where we are as we head into the last quarter of 2018, as we look forward to 2019, where we are with CSS Layout, because we've had some fairly big shifts in that landscape over the last few years. Last year, CSS was actually 20 years old. This makes me feel very old because I remember when we didn't have CSS. I am someone who built websites with tables for layout, and I remember CSS coming along and just for fonts and sort of saying, oh, I'm not sure about this. Not sure about this at all. So I've kind of grown up with CSS, and I've seen what's happened, how things have progressed over time. And at some point, we moved away from the whole tables for layout thing, and we started doing stuff with CSS and doing CSS for layout, and all our websites got really simple looking. We're like, well, this is the web. This is what the web looks like. And I think actually a lot of things that we say are web-like actually stem from a technical limitation. The fact that by using floats and absolute positioning, there's actually very limited things that we can do. And when you look at actually what we've managed to achieve, by really hacking around with floating things, left and right, and making sure they're not too big and that we don't end up with more than 100%, because then all sorts of weird things happen to our layout. Everything that we've done so far on the web to do layout has really been this kind of series of hacks. And for the first time, over the last couple of years, with things like Grid coming out, we've actually got what we could call a true layout system for the web. And that makes a huge change to everything that we're doing. And so when we think about this system for layout, I think most people would probably think about things like Grid and Flexbox. And that's really all based on top of this idea of flow layout, of normal flow, of the way that things just behave by default if we don't start doing any layout. And we've got things like multiple column layout, which I have to mention because that's one of the specs that I edit. But that's a specification that's there to do that kind of column-based layout. So they're the big specs. They're the things that we'd think if someone said, what is there in CSS Layout today, you might think, oh, well, there's CSS Grid, there's Flexbox. But those things are held together by some other specifications, and they're really, really key to understanding the big specs that we talk about. We've got things like writing modes, which are really hard to talk about unless you start thinking about logical properties and values. We've got box alignment, and we've got CSS sizing, intrinsic and extrinsic sizing, which is really important now that we're talking about layout that can kind of work out its sizing itself. We're not taking control. We're not giving things a width and pushing them around to make something that looks like a grid. We're actually letting the browser kind of work out a lot of that stuff for us. So sizing becomes really key. And we also have these ways of providing really great experiences to our users, whatever they're using to view our websites. Because the web has kind of exploded with all these different devices. I remember way back when I started with the web, and my first computer had a 640 by 480 screen. And then I got a better screen that was 1024 by 768, and I felt marvelous. It was enormous. And I couldn't wait for everybody else to have as big a screen as I'd got. What websites could I create if I had all that screen space to deal with? And just as everyone started to get these nice big screens, they also got phones. And then suddenly we were having to deal again with the fact that some people had a very small screen in front of them. And now, of course, we're getting web pages displayed on watches. And we can't really sort of think, well, how are we going to support all of these different things? We have to develop in a way that is going to cope with the fact that these exist, and half of them we don't really know what they are. And so we've got things like media queries. And then we've got feature queries, the ability to detect what CSS is available. So these things are all really important. And then we can't forget some of the other things that are making their way into browsers. We've got CSS shapes, taking us away from everything looking like a little box. We've got transforms, things like scroll snapping, and variable fonts. And we're talking about layout here. But things like variable fonts can have a huge impact on our layouts, being used creatively. And so in this talk, I really want to look at some of those specifications that actually pull together our big layout specs. And you'll see plenty of grid and flexbox code. But I think it's really important to look at these things that pull these other specs together, because actually a lot of the things that we think are confusing about grid and flexbox, for example, is sort of understood through things like writing modes. So let's have a look at writing modes. Because it shouldn't matter which way up your component is. If we've got a grid and we turn it on its side, like we're using a vertical writing mode, there's no reason why that grid shouldn't behave in exactly the same way, tipped over on its side. So writing modes is actually a really good place to begin an exploration of new layout. Because even if you actually never use a writing mode other than the default, understanding writing modes tells you a lot about how grid and flexbox actually work. Because these layout methods have got writing mode support baked in, because they've been developed sort of since the point at which we thought, well, hang on, people actually use vertical writing modes. Perhaps we should have layout methods that cope with that. So a horizontal top-to-bottom writing mode, like English or Arabic, a left to right or a right to left language, it doesn't matter which way the text runs, if it's horizontal, then we have an inline dimension which runs horizontally. The inline dimension, that's the way that your text runs in the writing mode that you happen to be using. So if that's the inline dimension, then the block dimension is the direction in which blocks lay out down the page in that writing mode. So if we take a vertical writing mode, then the inline dimension is running down the page, top to bottom. So because that's the way that the sentences flow in that writing mode. And the block dimension is going to be running horizontally. Now, you might use a writing mode to typeset some text in that writing mode, but you could also use it creatively. It's quite common in print to see a headline running down the side of the page. Well, you can do that with writing modes. You can use writing modes in a creative way. And once you start to work with those different writing modes, the fact that web design is essentially tied to the physical dimensions of our screen starts to become a little bit weird. So I've got here a simple grid layout. Now, if I was to turn that into a vertical writing mode, what's going to happen then is that the grid is kind of going to flip, but the width that's applied to it is going to remain relative to the viewport. It's not going to go with the whole grid. So what I can use is a logical property, a replacement for width, which is inline size. So now the inline size, the size in the inline direction, is 500 pixels. So the whole grid kind of flips over on its side, and it all kind of remains relative to the flow direction. And that's what's really important about these writing modes and about logical properties, is we've got these mappings for things which are tied to the physical dimensions of the screen and tying them to make them kind of flow relative. There's a whole bunch of these. There's an entire spec full of them. This spec is very readable because essentially all it's doing is saying, oh, well, you've got these things which are physical properties. Well, here is the equivalent as a logical property. It's all kind of coming into browsers. Firefox at the moment, I think, has the best support for logical properties and values, but they're being rolled out in other browsers because once we're dealing with different writing modes, it all just becomes very weird to be dealing with width once you've tipped something over on its side. I've written a bunch of stuff about this. This article has got a load of demos and things in. The resources of this talk, I'll give you at the end a link to all of these things, but there's lots of demos you can play around in. If you use Firefox, they'll all work, and you can see how logical properties and values will work. But they're just mappings, essentially, for things that we already have. And in reality, you're going to be using both things, because sometimes you do want stuff tied to the dimensions of the screen. Other times you want it to follow the way the content is going. And so then we have box alignment. Because once we understand writing modes and realize that our layouts are not pinned to the top left of the screen, then alignment starts to make a lot more sense. And the thing with the alignment properties, there's a bit of history there. When we first got Flexbox, we were all very excited because suddenly we could properly center things, both horizontally and vertically. It was like this spec had appeared, and that was the most important thing about Flexbox, was the ability to center things. We've been waiting a long time for that, it's fair. So those properties appeared in Flexbox, and what happened was, it's obvious that they're actually going to be more useful to be used across other layout methods. So they've been removed from the Flexbox spec and put into this box alignment spec, which means that we can use the same alignment properties across any layout methods. And the one that really comes to mind, of course, is grid layout, which is why if you know a bit about Flexbox, you start using grid and you're like, oh, this is very similar. A lot of things work in the same way. But one of the things that people say they're very confused about when they look at the alignment properties in grid and Flexbox, they say, well, when do I align things and when do I justify them? We've got these sort of sets of properties. Are we aligning or are we justifying? Which axis are we dealing with? So we'll start with grid. If you've ever found alignment confusing in Flexbox, it is much easier to look at grid first, because with grid we always have two axes and they kind of stay in the same place, so we can sort of work out what the alignment does in grid fairly easily. So if your properties begin with align, they work on the block axis. It doesn't matter if your block axis is like in English and is running down the page, or your block axis is in a vertical writing mode and so is running across the page. You align on the block axis. And you justify, therefore, on the inline axis. Now, I remember that because I think about text justification. If you're going to justify your text in an editor, then you would be doing that along the sentence. So that's the inline direction. So that's where we justify. So we can have a look at how that works in grid. So if we use align self, the default is stretch, so we get those kind of full height columns. If we align self to start, then on the block direction, we go to the start, so the start edge there. If we align self to the end, we're going to go to the end edge of that axis, and if we center, we get our nice centering. So that's all on the block axis. And so then if we justify, then we're dealing with the inline axis. So we justify self-center, and the little box goes right into the middle, because it's being centered in that grid area that it's sat in. And if we justify self-start, then it goes to the start. And so then if we look at a different writing mode, if we go into a writing mode, vertical RL, and I'm already using inline size there, so the box is going to tip over, you can see the alignment properties work in exactly the same way because we're still dealing with the block and the inline axis. Really usefully, if you're working with grid layout, you want to be using Firefox and you want to use the grid inspector. I'm inspecting my grid here, and you can see how all of the lines of the grid and the tracks, they're all apparent and you can see them. You can work out, especially when you're doing alignment and you're pushing things around inside that box, it's really handy to be able to see what the grid area is that you're aligning in. And so definitely, even if you don't normally use Firefox for development, Chrome have gone down the lines of giving us really great tools for dealing with performance and so on. Firefox are putting a lot of work into designer tools. So things like the grid inspector, the CSS shapes editor, all really useful stuff if you're designing for the web and you want to play around in the browser. So some other things we might be working with. We have languages which run right to left, and that affects things like grid layout and alignment too. If you're working in a right-to-left language, or for some reason you've just changed the direction, which is probably less likely, and you're then using justify items. So we've got justify items start. If we're working left to right, the start is on the left-hand side. If we change our direction to right to left, then start is on the right-hand side, because it works with the writing mode and the direction of the text. And Flexbox is exactly the same. So then when we justify items end, that actually goes to the left-hand side if we're in a right-to-left language. And there's something else we might want to align with grid, and that's the grid tracks themselves. We tend to think of grid layouts and we've got, the entire area is taken up by grid tracks and they completely fill the grid container. But your tracks might not take up all of the available space. And in that case, you need to decide what to do with the leftover space. You've got some grid tracks, and then we've got a bit of space left over. Here I've got some space. The grid tracks by default are aligned to start in both the block and inline dimension, and we've got that bit of space either side of them at the end of the tracks and at the bottom of the tracks. There's a little bit of space left over. So we use align content on the block axis again to deal with that space. So if the tracks are moved to the end, then the space is put at the beginning. The content properties are all about space distribution, and we can center them. So when you're dealing with align content and justify content, what you're doing is you're dealing with available space. If you've got no available space, nothing is actually going to happen because there's nothing to share out. And so we get that sort of proper centering of our tracks. So if we go to space between, the tracks all kind of blow apart and our gaps all get bigger. And if we look in the grid inspector again, you can see how those tracks and the actual gaps in between have spread out. And also any items that span over those tracks, they also spread out. So this is something to be aware of if you're spacing out tracks in grid layout. Things are going to get bigger than you expected. And again, Firefox Grid Inspector showing us what's actually going on there and letting us make decisions about our design. So in grid, I think that those properties seem fairly consistent. Once we remember that we're working on the block and the inline axis and which properties are which, it's fairly straightforward. Flexbox is a little bit more complicated because we can mess around with our flex direction. And so in Flexbox, it is much easier to think about the main axis and the cross axis. And so the main axis is the axis that you use when you set your flex direction. If you say flex direction row, that's your main axis. If you say flex direction column, that's your main axis. And a row will always be in the inline direction in your writing mode. So a row in English is running horizontally, and a row in a vertical writing mode is going to be running up and down the page. On the cross-axis, we've got all three properties. We've got align content. If we've got wrapped flex items, we've got align cell and align items, and we'll have a look at those. On the main axis, we've only got justify content, because in Flexbox, we're just dealing with space distribution. So if we look at Flexbox and we use justify content on the main axis. So here I'm working with a row, and I'm going to move all my items to the end, and the space goes before them. And if we do space between, the space is shared out in between the items, and it's nice and flexible. If we change the flex direction to column, I've got a height there, so I've got some extra space, then it's working exactly the same. We're using justify content in the direction of the flex direction, and we've got this space, and we're spacing it out between. And just as with grid, if we change our writing mode, it all just flips round, and it all behaves in exactly the same way, because we care about writing modes. Something to note, there's no justify self or justify items in Flexbox because you're dealing with items as a group on the main axis. You're not dealing with separate items in Flexbox. But on the cross-axis, you can have wrapped flex items that wrap round, and if you have wrapped flex items and you've got some extra space, then you've got some space to distribute. So on the cross-axis, we can use the align content property, and it works exactly the same as justify content. If we've got some spare space, we can then use that property to share out the space, to move the items around, to center them, to give them space between. And once again, it behaves in exactly the same way if you're working in a vertical writing mode. And so your columns are running across the page. Now on the cross-axis, that's where you might want to align your items against each other. Your flex container has a height of some sort, something is defining the height. It might be that, as in this case, the tallest item is giving that line a height, or it could be that you've given the flex container a height itself. So once you've got a height, you can then align the items against each other. So you can align them to flex start. So instead of stretching to the height of the flex container, they all hop up and go to the start. And if you align them to flex end, and as you can see, we're working with align, so we're working on the cross-axis, dealing with our items. If you change the flex direction to column, then it works in exactly the same way because our cross-axis is now running across the screen, and so we can move our items around on that axis. And this, of course, works in exactly the same way. We go with our writing modes, and we can switch it around with writing modes, and columns go in the way that columns run in that writing mode, and it all works in the same way. So alignment is pretty neat. When I introduced the alignment spec, I said, well, the alignment properties were taken out of the Flexbox spec, and they were put into their own specs. They could be used by other layout methods. Now, they've got implementation in Grid, so we can use those alignment methods in Grid Layout. They are also specified for block layout. And that would mean that you could just have a box inside another box and use the alignment properties to center it. At the moment, there isn't any browser implementation of that. So if you have one thing that you want to center inside another thing, the best way to do that at the moment is to turn the outer into a flex container, and then you can use the Flexbox properties to do your proper vertical and horizontal centering. In the future, we won't have to make that step of also making the thing a flex container, because we'll just be able to do alignment on block layout. But there's no real problem in making containers flex containers. It's just a little bit weird that you have to do that to make things center. At some point in the future, we'll get there and we'll be able to do that. But something we are getting as part of box alignment, in the box alignment spec, as well as all those nice alignment properties getting moved from Flexbox, also the gap feature, which shows up in Grid and in Multicol, that's also been moved into box alignment. So this idea of having gaps, gutters between items, when the Grid spec first appeared, it didn't have any idea of gutters. And this was something I really pushed for, that we should be able to specify a gap between Grid items, because that's a kind of normal thing that you want to do in design. And so we've now got row gap, column gap, and gap specified in the box alignment property. Box alignment spec. If you've worked with Grid Layout, you will know that we have grid gap, grid row gap, and grid column gap, kind of grid prefixed. They've been renamed as just column gap, row gap, and gap, but those prefixed grid versions will live forevermore as aliases because they've been around already and people have shipped things using them, so you don't need to worry about that. It's kind of for backwards compatibility reasons, we'll keep them. But the nice thing about those gap properties being part of box alignment is that we will get them in Flexbox. Now, the only browser which has started to implement the gap properties for Flexbox is Firefox. It's in Firefox nightly at the moment. I think it's going into the next shipping release. And you'll then be able to do gaps between your Flex items without having to do manky negative margins on the outside and margins in between the items. So I think that's going to be really nice. But it's also a great example of how specs are kind of evolving. We're coming up with some CSS in one specification, and then it's sort of making its way out into other specs where it becomes obvious that we need it. So that's kind of a bit of process and things that are happening. And people ask me all the time, oh, should I use Grid or Flexbox? And as you can see, these things have so many common features. The answer really is use both or either, but use the one that works best. No one ever asks me whether they should use font size or color. And it's kind of like that. Use the layout method that works. We're not picking between Bootstrap and Foundation here. It's all just CSS. So use the method that works, and the best way to find out which method works best for the components you're building is just to build it. Build it. See, oh, actually, this is really two-dimensional. So maybe it's not a flex component, it's a grid component. And it doesn't matter what sort of component you're building. You can have grid components that are tiny little things. If it's two-dimensional, it's probably grid. If you just want something squishy and flexible, it's probably Flexbox. And there's crossover there. But play around, because the more of this stuff that you build, the more it will become obvious. You look at something in a design and say, that's definitely grid, or that's definitely Flexbox. And on really that note, sizing is another area where we've gained this consistency between layout methods. But it really exposes the difference in terms of how we've learned to size things in the past, because our new layout methods are flexible. We've already seen how they distribute space between items, and they also kind of distribute space inside items. So a lot of demos out there for Grid, they give you something like this, and it looks like the FR unit. If you have 3 1FR tracks, you've got 3 equal width tracks. And that's not really quite what you've got. You've only got 3 equal width tracks if you've got equal sized items in those tracks. If we put a very long word that doesn't break into one of our tracks, then we don't have 3 equal sized tracks at all. And that's because Grid is sizing things based on auto, saying, well, what size is the thing in this track, and how much space have we got left to distribute? If you actually want equal-sized tracks, then you're going to need to use min-max and give the minimum size 0. So you're saying this thing has no size, and its maximum is 1FR. And that will give you equal-sized tracks. It may well cause overflows. And that's the thing about these new layout methods. They're trying not to cause messy overflows. They're trying to take your content and display it in the best way possible. If you decide as the web designer that you want to do something different, that's fine. But by default, we're trying to display things in a good way. And Flexbox even more than that. I think Flexbox really, it's all about, I've got some stuff, please just display it in a reasonable manner. Don't overflow it all over the place. I don't want it poking out of the box. And so if your flex basis is auto, then growing happens from auto. The content's given a size, it's sort of its max content size, and then we work out whether we need to take space away or add space to let it fill the container. And if you don't want that, you make your flex basis 0. If your flex basis is 0, just like in Grid, we're saying this thing has got no size, please share out all of the space equally. But Flexbox at heart is kind of squishy. And it's just for putting the things into boxes and making them sort of work out well. And if you are putting widths on all of your flex items, or specifying the flex basis, as an absolute length, to try and make everything line up with something else, then it's quite likely that you probably want Grid, which is that layout method that does line things up with everything else. I could talk about sizing a lot. I have entire talks where I just talk about how big things are. I've written up a lot of that for Smashing Magazine. I think sizing is very, very important to understand to really use new layout well. And I think this sort of clever, squishy sizing of Flexbox and Grid, it does mean that we can get away with fewer media queries. It means that we can allow Grid and Flexbox to squish and grow and to distribute space inside the items, to distribute space in between the items without having to add lots of breakpoints. But we can enhance that layout with the use of media queries. Quite often people seem to be very, very desperate not to use any media queries and say, no, they're still useful. You might not need as many. You might not need lots and lots of tiny breakpoints. But they can really help us enhance the layout and kind of accommodate all of these different types of devices that we have. And we've actually got a new media queries spec, level 4 media queries, which brings us some new functionality that we can use. And we have this idea of media features. In the older spec, we sort of had this idea of kind of media types. You kind of got print and different kinds, but they're very, very broad. And actually, you don't really care what the thing is. You care what features it has, because there's quite a lot of crossover. People are viewing web pages on essentially EPUB readers, or on televisions, or we've got laptops that have touch screens. There are all these different devices, and they kind of all cross over. So it's a kind of bad thing to be looking at, well, how big is the screen? Oh, it must be a touch screen, because my laptop's got a touch screen, it's not a phone. So what we're doing is we're saying we've got these media features. What features does this environment have? And one of those media features, which actually has been implemented in various browsers, is to detect the type of pointer the user has, because that's useful information. Has someone got a fine pointer, which is like a mouse, so you can click very accurately on small things? Or have you got a coarse pointer? You're using your finger to touch things and drag things around. So that's, two different types of ways of interacting with the content. That's a useful thing for us to be able to detect. Have we got that coarse pointer or a fine pointer? So we can work out how our user is interacting with the application or site that we've built and maybe change things, perhaps make the hit areas larger if we know that someone is using a touch screen. And along with media queries, it's all very well knowing that the user has a certain type of device or how big that device is or how they're interacting with it. That's a useful thing for us to know. But we also have this idea of, well, what CSS has the user got? If I do a really fancy grid layout, does the user get that? Or do they get something else? We never really know, and we're never going to know. So what we need is a way for us to ask the browser exactly what CSS it supports. And that's what feature queries do. They let us say, hey, web browser, do you support grid? Do you support shapes? Do you support this fancy new CSS that we haven't even thought up yet? And then if the browser does support it, we can use it. And if it doesn't, then the fallback CSS will be used. And they kind of look like this. They just look like a media query, except we're saying at supports. Do you support, and then whatever you're looking for. Property value, which means that you can get quite fine-grained. If you know that, some feature of a specification isn't supported, you can just look for that. You could look for prefixed things, the few that are still around. So you can find out whether the browser supports something and then do something because of that. And that works really well because we've got really good support now for feature queries. Everything, all the new browsers, the browsers that you are likely to come across that don't support feature queries are your old IEs. It doesn't really matter that old IE doesn't support feature queries, because what you do is you use the way that CSS works. You write your old CSS that works for any old browsers that happen to come along, any non-supporting browsers that show up. Then you have your feature query, and then inside there you write your code that overwrites the kind of old layout and adds all your fancy new stuff. That's kind of the way CSS works. And a browser that comes along that doesn't understand feature queries is just going to go, I don't know what that is, and ignore it. Because that's how CSS works. It's this wonderful language that just, if a browser comes along that doesn't understand some of CSS, it just totally ignores that stuff. So you can wrap up anything which might cause a problem for a browser that might get bits of it, but not, say, the grid code in a feature query, and sort of safely use it. Anything new that comes along in CSS from this point, you can use a feature query to detect support of and use it. It lets you sort of safely use things in your CSS and try things out and enhance your layouts for people who have support for whatever comes along. This is a useful article by Jen Simmons, which takes you through how to use feature queries in exactly that way, layering on support for things that support. In that case, I think grid is mostly what she's talking about. Because the thing is, I think a lot of us, we're having to still support old IE browsers, and that's probably the browsers that we all think, I wish they would go away. But it's always been the case. I remember when Netscape 4 was the old browser that we all wished would go away, and then IE6 was the old browser that we all wished would go away. This is never going to change. Although browsers are, shipping new releases faster than ever, new CSS is coming out faster than ever too. And you're never going to get a point where, a new CSS feature is developed by the CSS working group and overnight it appears in everybody's browsers. That's just not going to happen. And increasingly, we've got people, around the world who are using mobile phones to access web content, and some of those are quite old. They're locked to older versions of browsers. We don't know what anyone's looking at our sites with, and we can't rely on those fancy new features being available to them. And so there's always going to be browsers that don't support something you want to use. Hopefully those things will, progress more quickly most of the time, but it's always going to happen. And, here's a feature that I'm sure fairly soon we're going to be saying, this browser doesn't support this feature. And that's the subgrid feature of CSS Grid Layout. When we sort of specified Grid Layout, there was, in the level 1 spec, this idea of subgrids. And the thing about subgrids, you see with Grid Layout and with Flexbox, it's only the direct children of your grid container that become grid items. So if we have a design like this. This is the sort of design that your designer brings to you. And they say, look, I've got these 3 boxes, and I want them, I want them laid out like this. And you're like, oh, yep, we can do that with grid layout. That's a really simple 3-column grid. And you put the content in, and it goes into the CMS, and then you end up with this. Because the designer never gives you content that, like, some of the headings are taller and so on. That's not what you ever get. It's always very neatly lined up because it's got the same amount of text. And yet when things get into the real world, they don't line up as neatly. You have something might have a bigger font size or more content or whatever is going on. It's not going to line up properly, and that goes back to the designer, and they're like, I wanted those headings to line up. And it's like, go on, off you go and sort it out. And you can't, because those cards are all individual things, while the outer is all using grid layout, and each of the cards is in a nice column with grid. And we can make the internals a grid layout, because we can make a grid item a grid itself. We still can't make those things line up with each other because they're independent. They're completely independent grids. What we actually want is to be able to say, well, this 3-column grid thing has also got 3 rows. And the header of each item goes into the first row, and the content goes into the next row, and the footer goes into the row after that, which means they can all line up with each other. Now, we can't do that at the moment, but subgrid, which is in level 2, will let us do that. It will let us say, actually, I would like this internal card to use the grid that is defined on the parent. And that's going to be incredibly powerful. It will let us do things like have a 12-column grid system where things, not only the direct children sit on that grid, but things inside can also line up with the same column tracks. That's going to be there for us to use. Of course, it's probably fairly unlikely that it's just going to appear in all browsers immediately. So again, feature queries will let us detect whether we've got the subgrid value of grid template columns and grid template rows, and maybe do something slightly different if we don't. Actually, the subgrid feature is kind of pretty much finished in terms of the specification, so we're really just waiting now for browsers to start to implement it. I really hope that will happen soon. So the thing is, all this is really positive. I think, I'm very excited about all of this new layout stuff. I hope you are too, but it does bring us new challenges. We've got all of this shiny new stuff, and I think we're only just learning how to deal with some of the accessibility implications that these new powers give us. Flexbox and Grid both allow for some level of content reordering. In Flexbox and in Grid, you can use the order property to directly reorder things. In Flexbox, you can change the flex direction to row reverse or column reverse. Grid has things like dense packing for auto placement, and obviously you can then position things on lines. And so you could very easily end up disconnecting the visual display with the source. So someone, for instance, tabbing around the document kind of ends up jumping all over the place, and that would be quite unpleasant. This is something that we kind of need to figure out how we deal with. We don't really have a good answer for that in CSS yet. I think that at some point we're going to have to work out how we can let a web designer say, I want the browser to follow the visual layout and not follow the source. But at the moment, anything tabbing around, anything reading out the content is following the source and not the visual display, and it's really worth remembering that. A very simple test is, can you tab around, can you keyboard navigate around your site after you've used Grid? If you can, you're probably okay. But we've got new problems, new things to worry about. And one of these things came up fairly recently, and really this is a bug in browser implementations. We've got this very interesting thing called display contents. Interesting feature because it lets us remove a box visually from the display. So if, for instance, you've got a bunch of list items, they need to have a UL, and then you've got your LIs. If you had a parent sort of grid structure going on, you just wanted those list items to sit on the grid, you can use display contents to visually remove the UL and then leave the items, but semantically, the UL should still be there. Anyone coming to the site, using a screen reader should know that that's a list. So this is really kind of how this works. I've got a grid here. As we know, direct children participate in grid layout. The children of those items do not. Adding display contents to the grid item removes the box of that item and anything about the box, the width, the borders, anything like that, and the children can then participate in grid layout. That's really neat. As I say, semantically, it should still remain whatever the element was in the first place. There is a bug in all the browsers that have implemented that mean that actually, semantically, it doesn't mean that. They're also saying, oh, well, you've removed that list, you've removed that table structure, and therefore you are now no longer a list or a table. That is a bug. The spec says they shouldn't do it, but they do. It's getting fixed. This post is a really good rundown of what display content is and the potential problems with it. But the thing here really is just that we've got this new stuff, and there are going to be new things that pop up. And you might be the first person to encounter one of them, because this stuff is so new. And some of these problems might show up only in combination with other bits of CSS. So, do be looking out for stuff and testing if you're using new stuff. Don't be so sure that people won't have introduced bugs like this. When it was first mentioned to me, I was like, what? But the spec doesn't say that. But, bugs happen. And so we've got this amazing new system for layout. It really is so fantastic how far things have come in the last few years, and we're not stopping here. As I say, we've got subgrid coming along. We're not stopping here. And when you hit the edges, when you're working with this stuff, and you're like, hang on, why can't we do whatever? Then let us know. Because so much of what I've shown you today just comes from filling in the needs of people who've said, why can't we do whatever? Well, because no one's specified that yet. No one's implemented it. No one's come up with it. So as we're using this new stuff, when you find the places where there are things that we can't yet do, let us know. This is how you let the CSS working group know. These are the issues on CSS specs. Now, some of those look baffling even to me, and I'm part of the CSS working group, but a lot of them are very straightforward things that people are asking for and showing examples. And in fact, actually, the more you can describe the use case, the thing that you can't do, the better. Because it turns out that developing CSS is much like developing any product. If someone uses your product and they come along with a really good use case and say, I need to do this thing, and I can't do it because, and I'm working around it by doing this, then often it's really easy as a product developer to say, oh yeah, we could add that. I could fix that for you. And it's the same for CSS. If someone comes along and says, look, this is something we can't do, and we're having to do it with JavaScript, and it makes it a bit slow and janky. It'd be great if we had a CSS way to do it. That's actually something that may well get picked up and specified and implemented. And because, things are happening so much more quickly, it's not going to happen for the project you need to work on tomorrow, but it might be around, next year. Do yourself a favor for your future self, as it were, and sort of talk to people and explain the things that you can't do. Because when we look at browsers now, look at what's going in. These are the last releases of a few browsers. Firefox 62, CSS shapes in the shape path editor, variable fonts. Chrome 69, scroll snapping, display cutouts for your notches, conic gradients. Edge had variable fonts. Every time a browser release ships, there is a whole bunch of new stuff, isn't it? It's a really, really exciting time to be a web developer. I've been doing this for 20 years, but it's why I'm still excited about it. Why I haven't gone off to do something else, and why I still want to participate and keep making it better. And I really hope that you are all excited about it too. And all of my code examples and the slides and so on and some resources are at that URL. Thank you for listening. Enjoy the rest of the conference.